Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida. Our guest today is Isaac Kfir from the Institute for Counter-Terrorism in Israel and a visiting fellow at Syracuse University. Welcome, Dr. Kfir.
Hi, thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about your work at Syracuse. You're here temporarily as a visiting fellow. What is that about?
I am part of the Schusterman Foundation, the ACE program, the American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise, where they bring over about 20 Israeli scholars every year to the United States, to various universities. At Syracuse, I teach at the College of Law and Public Administration. I teach programs in counterterrorism, in peacekeeping, and also in international human rights. Also, we have at Syracuse the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism, where I work with Professor William Banks on issues relating to national security and revisiting the Geneva Convention and the Hague Convention.
Why don't we go back in time a little bit so you can help us explain how you came to the study of terrorism, and specifically if this was an interest of yours in college and graduate school or if it's something that developed afterward.
It developed afterwards. Really 9/11 for me was the defining moment. I came out of law school and remember exactly where I was when the first plane hit. And I realized that the world was never going to be the same. I had friends as well working in the towers. And then luckily enough, I met Professor Boaz Ganor at the ICT, and he really introduced me to the study of terrorism. And what he advised me to do is to start reading about it and take an interdisciplinary approach. And I really like that methodology. And ever since then, it's been a fascinating study.
So you were actually born in the UK, is that correct?
No, I was born in Israel, but I was raised in the UK.
Raised in the UK,
yeah.
And then went back to Israel at what point?
I spent a couple of years traveling around the world and realized that I needed a place to settle down for a little bit. And I thought, I'll try Israel for a while. Was looking for a job, and Dr. Ganor was kind enough to take me on in the Institute.
Uh-huh. Now, what does your research at the Institute focus on?
Well, I do two things, really. I mean, on the one hand, I focus on terrorism, predominantly the situation in South Asia, Pakistan, India, again, under the advice of Dr. Ganor. But I also am very interested in peacekeeping. I think it's interesting for me to see where one starts and the other finishes, whether there are conditions conducive to terrorism or to peacekeeping. So I take the dual approach. And also I'm a lawyer by training, so nowadays I also engage in international human rights studies, law and post-conflict reconstruction, which is a program that Syracuse will be offering next year.
Oh, great. Well, you mentioned Pakistan. In this country we spent a lot of time in recent years focused primarily on Iraq, but now attention has returned to Afghanistan and to Pakistan, which are closely related as an issue. Tell us your evaluation of the situation in those two countries, and I don't know if you would start with one or the other, but yeah. Where are we, and how serious, how problematic is it?
I think it is a major problem. I think the American government, the American people have been very generous in the way they've approached the operation in Afghanistan. It's a very expensive operation. We are talking about rebuilding a country torn not only just by decades of war, but almost by a century of war. And again, American troops, over the 100,000 American troops who are now in Afghanistan, will be taking a very tough role in providing security, but also reconstruction. I think, though, what we have there is an issue of cultural differences. We are talking about a community, predominantly Pashtun, over 40% are Pashtun, who see the American presence as that of an invader and are very hostile towards it. I think winning the hearts and minds of those individuals is going to be a major challenge, especially when we lack the security, the permanent security that is required. Pakistan, of course, is another major problem for the United States. I mean, America and Pakistan have always had a very turbulent relationship. It's very much of an up and down issue. And it's a bit worrying that Pakistan is still unable to deal with the radical Islamists that exist in its midst. I mean, I think they're trying, and they've made some major advances, but we're talking about 165 million people. It is really a country of two worlds. You go to Karachi, it's a modern city. High rises, disco music, and so on and so forth, pop idol and so on. But you travel 20, 30 kilometers outside of Karachi, Islamabad, you've entered a different world. You've entered the world where women are certainly restricted in everything that they do. You've entered a world where women wear burqas, they're not allowed out of their homes. It's going to be a very, very difficult challenge to try and bring about a transformation in Pakistan, especially when America is seen in such a negative light, and I think unfairly as well, but it is seen in.
So you have Pakistan with its own challenge, Afghanistan with its challenge. How vital is Pakistan to the resolution long term of the problems in Afghanistan?
I think Pakistan is central. I think because of Pakistan has always been very influential as to what's happening in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a landlocked country. In order to get any access to heavy goods, heavy equipment, it needs the friendship of Pakistan. In the 1950s, for example, when there were tensions between Kabul and Islamabad, the Pakistanis simply closed the border and the Afghanis couldn't send their goods out. And they can always do it again, and I think that's an issue. When Musharraf was in power in Pakistan, he and Karzai barely spoke. We can't have that. We really need close relations between whoever is in charge in Kabul and whoever is in charge in Islamabad.
Now, has the current U.S. administration been successful in bringing the two closer together than they were before?
I think Richard Holbrooke has tried very, very hard. I think General Ikenberry has tried. I think there's been some positive developments. America has tried to use the carrot and stick approach in terms of both. And it's been relatively successful in bringing the two sides at least to communicate with one another. There's certainly greater coordination in terms of military operations, in terms of security. But at the end of the day, it's the people on the ground that are going to make the difference. And I don't see so much of a connection between those who are sitting in Kabul and the ordinary Afghan farmer or the ordinary Afghan villager who has a very negative view of those who are in Kabul. They see them as elite, they see them as corrupt, decadent, and so on. And when you have that lack of connection between the people and the ruling elites, I think you have a problem.
To what you mentioned security issues in Afghanistan. There are also cultural and communication obstacles to overcome. Are we doing better with those challenges? To what extent do we in the United States and the West in general understand Pashtun culture specifically?
I think we're getting better. I think the American military, they've hired a bunch of anthropologists to try and understand the culture a little bit better. They've established a new center of operation of about 400 U.S. military officers who try to coordinate U.S., Afghan, Pakistani affairs. I think this is all positive. Also, the way the rotation is working. If you are serving in Afghanistan, you'll do a 12-month rotation. You'll go back to the U.S., and if your unit is going back, it will go back to the same area. The units are not rotated around Afghanistan, and I think that's very positive because that helps develop relationships. We're talking about a community where people, they really rely on interpersonal skills. And here again, the American and the international forces are doing an amazing job trying to earn the trust of the local population. The problem is when they leave, the Taliban come in and terrify people into submission.
Could you help our viewers understand that the Taliban are not a separate group? They are part of this environment.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the word Taliban means student. It comes from the word talib, and there are different forms of Taliban. We tend to use it as to see the Taliban as a homogeneous force. It's not. We have an Afghan Taliban, we have a Pakistani Taliban. Unfortunately, nowadays we're seeing a little bit of Taliban emerging in Africa. We've had examples in Nigeria and in Tanzania, which is a bit worrying. But the nature of the Taliban, when they emerged in the 1990s following the civil war, was to bring law and order to Afghanistan. And they were hoping to do it by imposing their version of Islam. Again, it is a very skewed version of Islam. It's a very doctrinatorial approach. It is also very restrictive when we're looking at the rights of women. But when we start breaking it down, we see that the different Taliban groups within Pakistan don't agree because some of them come from different ethnic origins. I mean, they might still be Pashto-based, but even within the Pashtun, we have different tribes with different clans, different extended families, and they don't generally get on particularly well.
Now, obviously, there are more ethnic and minority groups in Afghanistan than the Pashtun. How does that complicate the efforts underway?
Yeah, we have the Hazaras, we have the Tajiks, we have the Uzbeks. They're very, very important players. And I think following the election in 2009, there's been an attempt to try and bring them in more into the operation of Afghanistan. But we are talking about a country with a lot of powerful memories. Various Afghan leaders who predominantly come from the Pashtun tribes have been very difficult in dealing with the other ethnic groups. They have punished them. They have killed many different groups during the Afghan Jihad, 1979 to 1989. One of the leading Mujahideen fighters was a Tajik. There was also a couple of Uzbeks. They didn't work very well with the other groups, and I think that memory has remained. One of the leading individuals was General Massoud. He was assassinated on September 9th. 2001, right 2 days before 9/11, and that was done on purpose. It was done by Osama bin Laden or by Al Qaeda, probably on as a favor to Mullah Omar, because they saw Massoud as a possible threat to their rulership of Afghanistan, and people still remember that, and that creates, I think, tensions.
Now, you mentioned elections in 2009, and there are future elections coming up in Afghanistan. How does that work with this environment you just described? They seem to be polar opposites.
We have a perception that election is the way to go. But how can you have elections when over 50% of the populations are illiterate? They're still in the 2009 elections. They were using symbols to try and get people to vote. So I think we are still going to face a major challenge in this area. I think we're going to have to maybe reevaluate the way we approach our reconstruction of Afghanistan. Maybe elections are not the only way to go. Maybe education should be our key focus. But again, what type of education? In our society, we believe that boys and girls should be educated fairly. But if you travel to parts of Afghanistan, that's apostasy. So I think we have to very slowly try and earn the trust of the village elders, make them understand that educating women is for their benefits. It's not just for ours. So I think elections are going to be a major issue, but earning the trust of the village elders, the mullahs as well, are going to be very, very important.
So have elections in Afghanistan to date produced any constructive benefits, or is it still one of those questions that's up in the air?
I think the last election, 2009, has shown that really we have a lot of corruption in Afghanistan. I think over 1 million votes were cancelled as a result of electoral abuses. So it seems that there's a lot of questions here about whether the electoral process still works in or can work in Afghanistan. I think we need to really maybe think whether Karzai is the right man to trust, and how we're going to deal with the Taliban presence in the country. So I don't know yet.
But what is your sense? You were talking about how instrumental Pakistan is and will be to the resolution of issues in Afghanistan. What is the direction, based on your current interpretation, what is the direction Pakistan is taking right now, and is it helpful?
I think under General Kiani, the Chief of Staff of the Pakistani Army, they have been very active in pursuing their own version of the Taliban. We have to remember that a day does not go by in Pakistan where there is no suicide attack. and the death ratio is between 10 to at one point we had an incident with 70 people who were killed. And Pakistan is suffering. So we need to remember that. It's becoming a very bloody place in terms of violence. But the army has been very active, especially in the tribal areas. And they often, the Pakistani army has suffered over 800 casualties in the last couple of years, just in those areas. But even within the Pakistani state system, we do have the security services like the ISI, and that's probably the main threat, the Inter-Services Agency. They are often seen as the people who created the Taliban. They have a very skewed version of Islam, and they tend to abuse their position. But they also have a lot of power and a lot of money. And there isn't really an effective oversight over them. So I think once or if the Pakistani government, the civilian authorities can actually impose some level of control over the ISI, we will probably be in a better place.
And what should the U.S. role be in both of these instances? I think there's a tendency to think that the United States is essentially the only player, certainly the most prominent player, but there are other countries involved in Afghanistan especially, and we have to take that into consideration. This is not a single nation activity.
And it shouldn't be a single nation activity. I mean, we tend to put too much emphasis on the United States. We expect America to bail us out. And America shouldn't really. It's not, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda is a global threat. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that the Europeans have really failed to shoulder their level of responsibility. There was a decision a few months ago of the Dutch to remove their troops by 2011, and that doesn't send a positive message. So I think it's much more important that the international community, and not just the Europeans, I mean, we also have, the Chinese, the Russians, they have to come and help because they're going to be affected by the situation in Afghanistan. China has a border with Afghanistan. There's been instances of Chinese nationals targeted in Pakistan. That's going to be an issue, I think, to focus on. So all of those elements, so China, Russia, have to come in and help the international community deal with this problem. It shouldn't be an American issue alone.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you see the possibility of Chinese or Russian intervention?
No.
Okay.
No, that's the other unfortunate side. I mean, the Russians definitely will not go back to Afghanistan. It's like saying, will America ever go back to Vietnam? Never in a million years. But I think at least having maybe the Russians at the negotiating table, they have a lot of experience after all in Afghanistan. They've learned the hard way. And I think maybe if we can use their experience in terms of how do we deal with this culture, how do we deal with the insurgency, they might be quite useful. So will the Chinese. I mean, China is one of the most important countries in the world now. It has a permanent seat at the Security Council. We need China engaged. But we have to do it in a way that won't intimidate the Indians and won't intimidate the Pakistanis as well. I mean, China and Pakistan have a very good working relationship, and that's why China can be very useful. India, it's going to be, we're going to have to appease India. And here maybe America can play sort of a mediating role. Sort of a bridge between cultures. I mean, America, after all, is probably the best example of a melting pot. So, and a way to bridge cultures. Why not use that to bring in Russia, bring in the Chinese, create better multilateral relations?
If you were providing advice on how we might facilitate the successful resolution of these challenges over the next 5 to 10 years, what advice would you offer to the Americans, to the Europeans, to the Pakistanis, and so forth?
First of all, I think we have to move slowly. We've become too used to wanting answers within a few years. I mean, this is going to be a problem for a number of years, maybe even a number of decades. I think we have to engage in effective reconstruction, education, but education that doesn't seem as if we're imposing our values on these communities. It has to come from within. We mustn't appear, when I say we, it's not just America, it's the international community. We mustn't appear as if we're trying to dictate anything. Okay, we have to work with the local communities. And I think that's probably the most important element. Focus on the local communities because the local communities don't trust the governments. One of the reasons why the Taliban did relatively well is because they don't take as much money. They're not as corrupt as the government, let's say, of Afghanistan. Whereas the Afghan government might take 30 or 40% of whatever earning an Afghan villager will have. The Taliban will take maybe 10 to 12%. And that's a substantive differences. So I think we have to focus on building confidence, working with the local communities, showing them that, again, we can work with it within what they have.
Now, why don't we talk a little bit about your research? I know you have a book coming out at some point fairly soon on Pakistan specifically. Tell us what your focus is there and what you hope to accomplish.
I'm interested in finding out whether Pakistan can work as a functioning democracy as we understand it. Pakistan is a really fascinating country. There's a lot of similarities between Pakistan and Israel in that they're the only two countries really established on the basis of religion. Israel, of course, was supposed to be a homeland for the Jews. Pakistan was supposed to be a homeland for India's Muslims. And I'm trying to understand the nature of the Pakistani state, looking at the different ethnic groups that exist within Pakistan. The official language is Urdu, but the majority of people don't speak Urdu. We have Punjabis, we have Sindhis, we have Balukis. So I'm trying to see the different dynamics that make the Pakistani state exist as it is, because it always seems to be on the precipice of a disaster. There's always a coup, or there's always an overthrow of a civilian government. And I'd like to find out why is that. Now, I've yet to sort of formulate any conclusion. I'm still gathering my research material. But the more I study Pakistan, the more amazed I am by the generosity of the people, by the beauty of its culture, its arts. We tend to forget that. We tend to see Pakistan as, this is where the Taliban came, or this is where violence occurs. It's not just that. There's a vibrant Pakistani music industry. There is a great cinema culture. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. I'm looking at how culture, how ethnic issues are affecting the Pakistani state.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned peacekeeping. I wanted to touch on that a bit before we conclude. Tell us about your interest there. Do you focus on a specific region, or are you interested in peacekeeping generally speaking?
Having lived in Israel for the past 5 years, really sort of what my interest is the peacekeeping around the state of Israel. I'm talking about the Golan Heights, Lebanon, and the operation in the Sinai. And it's interesting to see how those operations have evolved over time. A lot of people have suggested that the operation in the Golan Heights has been very effective in maintaining peace between Israel and Syria. And one is interested to see if that can be replicated, let's say, to Kashmir or parts of Africa where peacekeeping hasn't been as effective as we would like. So again, it's a process of trawling through a lot of archival material to try and understand the processes that led to it, and seeing if we can take any lessons learned from those situations.
And finally, what do you hope to accomplish during your next year at Syracuse? Any special projects in addition to what you've mentioned here?
Well, at INSKIT, under Professor William Bank, what we're doing is that we're examining the laws of armed conflict into the 21st century. How do we deal with Al-Qaeda? So what we're trying to do is see whether we can re-examine some of the issues affecting the Geneva Convention, the Hague Convention, but also to see how Islam, the laws within Islam, can be used to help us understand how to deal with this new battlefield. And this is what really we're about. The questions regarding the transformation of conflict in the 21st century. The other thing that we'll be doing is post-conflict reconstruction, i.e. to examine, this is done under Professor Bruce Dayton, where we try to understand if there are any lessons that we can learn from either situations where we have been successful in post-conflict and where we have failed.
Good. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Kfir, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.